I never really believed in Bigfoot, not even a little. Growing up on a small sheep ranch in northern Idaho, I'd heard every version of the story. Campfire yarns about towering, shaggy creatures stalking the high country. Tourists insisting they glimpsed something along the highway at twilight. Local hunters claiming they'd stumbled across footprints as big as dinner plates. The usual kind of talk you hear around a fire or in a bar. Tales that grow taller with each retelling and each round of drinks. I always assumed it was just bears rearing up on their hind legs, or shadows twisting in the trees when the wrong way hit them the wrong way. Or maybe simply too much whiskey and an imagination running wild. My name is Jesse Collins, and I've been running the family ranch here at the foot of the Black Ridge Mountains for nearly about 15 years now. It's honest work, cattle mostly, some hay, a few horses. The kind of life where you know your land like the back of your hand, where every fence post and gully has a story. I thought I knew everything there was to know about this place. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. It started small, the way these things always do. Little oddities you can explain away if you try hard enough. But looking back now, sitting here in the dark with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, I realized those small things were warnings, signs I should have paid attention to. The first thing I noticed was the cattle. Now, cattle are creatures of habit. They follow the same paths, graze the same spots, bed down in familiar places. But about 3 months ago, they started acting strange. Not spooked exactly, but different. They'd broken through sections of fence I'd just repaired the week before. Good strong wire that should have held a bull in rut. And instead of spreading out across the pasture like they normally would, they began clustering in the dead center of the field, tight together, like they were afraid of the edges. At first, I figured it was predators. We get coyotes through here, sometimes a mountain lion drifting down from higher elevations. But the behavior was all wrong for that. When cattle sense a predator, they face outward, watching. These were facing inward, like they were trying to get as far from the boundaries as possible. Then the horses started refusing to go near the tree line. These were working horses, steady animals I'd trust with my life. But suddenly, they'd plant their hooves and refuse to move if you tried to lead them toward the woods. One evening, my mare Dancer actually reared and nearly threw me when I rode her close to the forest edge. Her eyes were rolling white, nostrils flared, every muscle trembling. I'd never seen her like that, not even during a lightning storm. But what really got my attention, what made me start questioning everything I thought I knew, that happened on a Tuesday night in late August. Though at the time, I didn't realize it would change everything. I should have known something was coming. The signs were all there. That Tuesday started normal enough. I was out mending fence in the south pasture when I did a head count, just routine, the kind of thing you do without thinking when you've been ranching long enough. Came up one short. Big red bull named Samson, 1,500 pounds of muscle and attitude, my best breeding stock. He wasn't with the herd, wasn't anywhere in the visible pasture. Now, a bull that size doesn't just vanish, and Samson especially. He was territorial, dominant. He should have been right there in the middle of the group, holding court like he always did. I spent the rest of the afternoon searching, riding the fence line, checking every draw and gully where he might have wandered. Nothing. No broken fence, no tracks leading off the property, no signs of a struggle. It was like he'd simply ceased to exist. By nightfall, I had to admit defeat and head back to the house, figuring I'd resume the search at first light. That night, I barely slept. Kept thinking about the value of that bull, sure, but also about how wrong the whole thing felt. In 15 years of ranching, I'd lost animals before, to disease, to predators, to plain bad luck. But I'd always found evidence, always found something. The next day brought more of the same. No Samson, no clues. I even called a couple neighbors, asked if they'd seen him wandering. Nothing. By the second night, I'd half convinced myself he'd somehow gotten through the fence and was miles away by now, or that thieves had hauled him off in the dead of night, though how they'd do that without leaving tire tracks or boot prints was beyond me. The second morning, I found him. He was lying at the eastern edge of the north pasture, maybe 50 yards from the tree line. I spotted him from the porch with my binoculars, that distinctive red hide standing out against the grass. My first thought was relief. At least I hadn't lost him entirely. My second thought was dread, because even from that distance, I could tell something was very wrong with the way he was positioned. I drove the truck out there, my stomach getting tighter with every yard. What I found, I still don't have a good explanation for it. Samson was dead. But he wasn't torn apart, wasn't bloated or clearly injured. He was just there. Laid out almost carefully, legs straight, head positioned like he was sleeping. 1,500 pounds of bull, arranged like someone had posed him. No drag marks leading to the spot. No signs he'd stumbled and collapsed. Just a massive animal, placed there deliberately. The ground around him was disturbed, grass pressed down in a wide circle. But what caught my eye were the depressions in the soft earth near his head. Footprints, or something like footprints. They were huge. Easily 17, maybe 18 inches long, and broad across the ball of the foot. Human-shaped, 5 toes clearly visible, but scaled up to an impossible size. The depth of them suggested incredible weight, far more than any man could account for. I knelt down beside one, placed my own boot next to it for comparison. My size 11 looked like a child's shoe. I want to say I immediately thought of all those stories I'd dismissed my whole life. But the truth is, my brain just refused to process it. I kept trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a bear print, just distorted by the soil. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank, though who and why I couldn't begin to guess. Maybe I was seeing things, stress and lack of sleep playing tricks on my eyes. But I knew what I was looking at. Deep down, in that part of your brain that evolution carved out for recognizing danger, I knew. Something had moved my bull. Something big enough and strong enough to carry or drag 1,500 pounds without leaving a trail. Something that walked on 2 legs and left prints like a man. I stood there for a long time, just staring at those tracks. The rational part of me was still fighting it, still searching for a logical explanation. But another part, a part I didn't like acknowledging, was already whispering the truth I wasn't ready to hear. This wasn't the end of the strangeness. Looking back, I realize this was just the beginning. The moment when whatever lived in those mountains decided to make itself known. I just didn't understand what that meant yet. I should have left right then, should have loaded up the truck and driven straight to town, shown someone official those prints, gotten help. But pride kept me rooted, pride and disbelief, and the stubborn certainty that there had to be a reasonable explanation I just hadn't thought of yet. That hesitation would cost me. I spent the rest of that day in a fog, going through the motions of ranch work, while my mind kept circling back to those prints. I buried Samson with the tractor, which felt wrong somehow, like I was destroying evidence of something important. But what else was I going to do? Call the sheriff and tell him I found Bigfoot tracks? I'd be a laughingstock by sunset. That night, I sat on the porch with a beer I didn't drink, watching the tree line as the sun went down. The forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows between the pines deeper and more solid. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, nerves playing tricks after a strange couple of days. Around midnight, I finally gave up on sleep and went to bed. Must have dozed off eventually, because I woke to my dog Rufus barking his head off downstairs. Not his "there's a coyote" bark or his stranger approaching bark. This was different, higher pitched, almost frantic, terrified. I grabbed my rifle and went to the window. The yard was empty, bathed in moonlight. Nothing moving. But Rufus was still going crazy downstairs, and now I could hear the horses in the barn whinnying and kicking at their stalls. Then I saw it. The main gate to the south pasture, the one I'd closed and latched myself just after dinner, was standing wide open. I watched that gate for a full minute, my heart hammering. No wind strong enough to blow it open. No way the latch had failed. I'd replaced it myself last month. Someone had opened it. Someone or something. I didn't go out there. I'm not ashamed to admit that. Instead, I sat in the dark by the window with my rifle across my knees, watching until dawn. The gate stayed open. Nothing else moved, but I had the distinct feeling I was being watched from somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence line. When morning finally came, I went out to investigate. The gate showed no signs of tampering, no damage to the latch. It had simply been lifted and swung open, then left that way. In the dust near the gatepost, I found them again, those same massive prints. Just a few partial impressions this time, but enough to make my blood run cold. This happened 3 more times over the next week, always at night, always a different gate. I'd wake up to find them standing open, the animals in a panic, and those prints nearby. Never any damage, never any animals missing or hurt, just gates opened and left that way, like someone was testing me, or sending a message I didn't understand. The rational explanations I'd been clinging to were crumbling fast. This wasn't kids pulling pranks. No teenager could reach the high latches without a ladder, and I'd have heard a vehicle approaching. This wasn't bears or any other animal. Bears don't open gates. Bears don't leave human-shaped footprints. On the 8th day, I drove into town and bought 4 trail cameras, the kind hunters use, with night vision and motion sensors. Cost me near $400 I didn't really have, but I needed to know. Needed proof, one way or another, even if it was proof of something I didn't want to believe. I mounted them at different points along the fence line, focusing on the gates and the areas where I'd found the tracks. Set them to take both photos and video, maximum sensitivity. If something was coming onto my property at night, I'd have it on camera by morning. That night, I barely slept again. Kept imagining what those cameras might capture. Part of me hoped they'd show nothing, that whatever had been happening would just stop, and I could convince myself it had all been some weird coincidence. But another part, the part that had seen those prints and that carefully positioned bull, knew better. Something was out there. Something that had taken an interest in my ranch for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. By morning, I'd know what it looked like. Though at the time, I had no idea how much that knowledge would change everything. How much I'd wish, later, that I'd just packed up and left before the cameras could show me the truth. Some things, once you see them, you can't unsee. Can't explain away or forget. I was about to cross that line. I checked the cameras just after dawn, my coffee going cold in the truck's cup holder as I drove the fence line. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the first camera. Nerves, I told myself, just nerves. But I think part of me already knew what I was going to find. The first 2 cameras showed nothing unusual. Deer passing through, a fox, some raccoons near the water trough. Normal wildlife, the kind of footage I'd expected when I bought the damn things. I was starting to relax, starting to think maybe the whole thing had been in my head after all. Then I checked the 3rd camera, the one I'd mounted on a post near the north pasture gate. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. The first few frames showed the empty pasture, fence posts casting long shadows in the infrared glow. Then movement at the edge of the frame. Something large stepping into view. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall. God, it was tall. Had to be 8 feet, maybe more, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, covered in dark hair that the night vision rendered in shades of gray and white. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for something so massive, stepping carefully over the fence line without touching it. But what it did next, that's what made my stomach drop. The creature walked directly to the broken fence post I'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. The wood had rotted at the base and was leaning at a 45-degree angle, barely held up by the wire running through it. I'd planned to replace it over the weekend, just hadn't gotten around to it yet. The creature knelt down, and I could see now it was definitely bipedal, definitely shaped like a man but scaled up to monstrous proportions, and examined the post. Then, with what looked like casual ease, it gripped the post near the break and lifted. Just lifted it, one-handed, like it weighed nothing. The other hand scooped dirt and small rocks from around the base, packing them in tightly. It was fixing my fence. I watched the footage 3 times, unable to process what I was seeing. This thing, this creature that shouldn't exist, that I'd spent my whole life dismissing as fantasy, was on my property at 3 in the morning, doing maintenance work. It spent nearly 4 minutes reinforcing that post, testing its stability, making sure it was straight and solid. Then it stood, surveyed its work with what I can only describe as satisfaction, and walked calmly back toward the tree line. Just before it disappeared from frame, it turned and looked directly at the camera. The night vision caught its eyes, reflective, glowing slightly in the infrared light. It stared for maybe 5 seconds, and I swear, even through the grainy footage, I could feel the intelligence in that gaze. It knew the camera was there, knew it was being watched. Then it was gone, melting back into the forest like it had never existed. I sat in my truck for a long time after that, the camera in my lap, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Every logical explanation I'd constructed over the past weeks crumbled to dust. This wasn't a bear, wasn't a hoax, wasn't stress-induced hallucination or misidentified wildlife. This was real. Something lived in those mountains, something that walked on 2 legs and had hands that could manipulate tools and fix fences. Something intelligent enough to know what a camera was and not care about being seen. The question that kept running through my mind was, why? Why fix my fence? Why open the gates but never hurt the animals? Why move Samson's body but leave it intact? What did this thing want? I drove back to the house in a daze, pulled up the footage on my laptop, and watched it again, and again. Looking for details I'd missed, trying to understand the behavior. The creature's movements were deliberate, purposeful. This wasn't random. Everything it had done on my property seemed calculated, intentional, like it was trying to communicate something. That thought should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, I felt a strange sort of calm settling over me. Fear, yes. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. but also curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe. The sense that some fundamental assumption about the world had just been proven wrong, and now I had to figure out what that meant. I saved the footage to 3 different drives and uploaded a copy to the cloud. Evidence, in case something happened to me. Then I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but felt necessary. I wasn't leaving. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, I needed to understand it. This was my land, my home. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't feel threatened. Not really. Not yet. That feeling wouldn't last. But in that moment, watching the sun rise over the Black Ridge Mountains, I felt something close to wonder. I should have trusted my fear instead. The cameras kept recording. Every night for the next week, I'd check them at dawn. And every night they showed the same thing. The creature, I'd stopped trying to call it anything else, would appear sometime between midnight and 4 a.m., always approaching from the tree line, always moving with that same deliberate purposefulness. But it never came closer to the house than the outer fence line. It would patrol the boundaries, sometimes stopping to examine something, a section of wire, a water trough, the cattle huddled in their nervous cluster. Once, I watched it spend 20 minutes observing the herd, just standing motionless at the fence, studying them like a rancher checking his stock. The animals stayed terrified. That's what convinced me this wasn't some peaceful coexistence. Not yet. The cattle continued their strange behavior, packed tight in the center of the pasture, refusing to graze near the edges. The horses still panicked at the slightest hint of the forest. Even Rufus, who'd never feared anything in his life, wouldn't leave the porch after dark. Whatever trust might eventually form, it hadn't happened yet. The creature was still an unknown threat as far as they were concerned. Then, gradually, things began to change. It started around day 5. The cattle didn't break any new fence sections. They were still clustered together, still avoiding the boundaries, but the panic seemed to lessen. Just slightly. They'd graze a bit in the morning, move around a little more. The horses stopped trying to bolt back to the barn at the first shadow. By day 7, I noticed the creature's pattern had shifted. Instead of ranging along the entire fence line, it was focusing on specific sections. The east and south borders, the areas closest to the deeper forest where the tree cover was thickest. The areas where, I realized with a chill, something else might approach from. It was establishing a territory, not claiming my ranch, but defending it? Marking boundaries? The thought seemed insane, but the evidence was there in the footage. I watched it mark certain trees along the fence line, rubbing its shoulders against the bark, leaving behind tufts of dark hair. Territorial behavior, just like a bear or a wolf. Except this was no bear. On the 8th night, the cameras caught something different. Something that made me understand, for the first time, what was really happening on my land. The timestamp read 1:23 a.m. The creature was standing at the eastern fence, perfectly still, its massive head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then I heard it. Even through the camera's tinny speaker, I could hear it. A low, resonant humming. Deep and rhythmic, almost musical. It seemed to vibrate through the air itself. The creature was making that sound, calling something. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, at the very edge of the frame, I saw movement in the forest. Shapes, hard to make out in the darkness. Multiple shapes, staying just beyond the tree line. Smaller than the creature, but not by much. They moved with a different quality. Jerky, aggressive, prowling. I watched the creature continue its humming, that strange, haunting sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck, even through a recording. The shapes in the forest seemed drawn to it, moving closer, trying to get a better look. Then the creature stopped humming. Just stopped. Complete silence. The shapes hesitated, I could see them now, caught in the edge of the camera's infrared range. Hunched figures, too tall to be human but moving almost ape-like, on all fours sometimes, upright others. 3 of them, maybe 4. Their eyes reflected the camera's light, glowing in the darkness. The creature took a single step backward, into the shadows between 2 trees, and vanished. 1 second it was there, massive and solid. The next, gone, like it had simply ceased to exist. The shapes in the forest went crazy. I watched them scatter, confused, searching for what had disappeared. They prowled the tree line for several minutes, agitated, occasionally making sounds that the camera barely picked up, clicks and grunts that made my skin crawl. Then they retreated back into the deep woods, frustrated and empty-handed. I sat back from the laptop screen, my heart pounding. What had I just witnessed? Some kind of territorial dispute? A distraction? The creature had deliberately drawn those things to the fence line, then vanished, leaving them disoriented and confused, leaving them away from something. Away from my ranch? Away from the cattle? The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. Those other things in the forest, whatever they were the real threat. They were what the cattle feared, what had the horses panicking. And the creature, this impossible thing that fixed my fences and patrolled my boundaries, it was keeping them away, protecting my land, protecting my animals, maybe protecting me. But why? What did it want in return? Nothing in nature is free. Everything has a price, a motivation. What was this thing's angle? I didn't know, but I was about to find out, in the worst possible way. Because those shapes in the forest, they weren't going to give up. And when they finally decided to make their move, I'd be caught in the middle of something I barely understood. Something that had been building for weeks, waiting for the right moment to explode. The next 3 days passed in an uneasy quiet. The creature continued its nightly patrols, but I noticed a change in its behavior. It was spending more time at the eastern fence, sometimes standing motionless for an hour or more, just watching the forest, waiting for something. The cameras showed those other shapes twice more, always staying just beyond the tree line, never venturing onto my property. But they were getting bolder. Each night they came a little closer, lingered a little longer, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. I started keeping my rifle closer at night, started sleeping in my clothes, boots by the bed. I didn't know what was coming, but every instinct I had was screaming that something was building, that the fragile equilibrium couldn't hold much longer. On the 4th morning, I found something that changed everything. I was doing my usual dawn check of the property, coffee in hand, Rufus trailing behind me for the first time in weeks. The dog had finally started acting normal again, which should have been a relief. Instead, it made me nervous, like whatever presence had been keeping him spooked had shifted its attention elsewhere. That's when I saw them. Stones. Large river rocks, the kind you find down by the creek bed, arranged in a wide circle around my house. Not a perfect circle. Nature doesn't do perfect, but deliberate, intentional. Each stone was roughly the size of a dinner plate, placed about 6 feet from the next one, forming a perimeter, maybe 50 yards from my front porch. I counted them. 37 stones. Some partially buried, like they'd been pressed deep into the earth. Others sitting on the surface, positioned with clear purpose. The circle encompassed the house, the barn, and the immediate yard. Everything else, the pastures, the outbuildings, the fence line, lay outside it. I walked the perimeter slowly, Rufus following with his tail low, whining softly. The stones weren't random. This was a marker, a boundary. But who was it meant for? Me, to keep me contained, or those things in the forest, to keep them out? Near the eastern edge of the circle, I found something else. A stone larger than the others, maybe 40 pounds, with markings on it. Not writing exactly, but deliberate scratches. Deep gouges in the rock surface that formed a pattern. I couldn't read it, couldn't understand what it meant, but the intentionality was unmistakable. This was language, communication, a message I lacked the ability to comprehend. I photographed everything, measured the distances, sketched the pattern on the marked stone. Part of me wanted to call someone, a wildlife biologist, a university researcher, hell, even the local news. This was evidence of something extraordinary, something that would change everything humanity thought it knew. But who would believe me? And what would happen if people came swarming onto my property with cameras and questions and guns? Would that protection I'd been receiving, and I was certain now that's what it was, would it continue? Or would I become just another piece of territory to defend? I decided to wait, to watch, to try and understand what was happening before I invited the outside world in. That decision probably saved my life, though at the time I had no idea how close I was to needing that protection. The cameras that night showed the creature again, but its behavior had shifted dramatically. Instead of patrolling, it spent hours reinforcing something I couldn't quite see at the forest's edge. Moving branches, arranging deadfall, creating what looked like barriers or blind spots, preparing for something. Around 2 a.m., the other shapes appeared again. 5 of them this time, more than I'd seen before. They emerged from the deep woods and approached the fence line with a confidence they hadn't shown previously. One of them actually crossed onto my property, moving in that unsettling half-crouch, heading toward the pasture where the cattle slept. The creature intercepted it before it got 20 yards. I watched the confrontation on grainy infrared footage, my hands gripping the laptop so hard my knuckles went white. The creature didn't attack, not immediately. It simply stood between the intruder and the pasture, blocking the path. The two faced off for what felt like an eternity, though the timestamp showed it was less than a minute. Then the intruder lunged, fast, impossibly fast. But the creature was faster. It sidestepped, grabbed the thing by what might have been an arm or shoulder, and threw it back across the fence line like it weighed nothing. The intruder hit the ground hard, scrambled up, and retreated into the forest with the others. The creature stood at the fence for another hour after that, unmoving, sending a message that was crystal clear even to me, watching from the safety of my house. This territory was claimed. This herd was protected. Cross that line again, and there would be consequences. I realized something then, sitting in the dark with that footage paused on the screen. Those stones around my house, they weren't just markers. They were a warning. A line in the sand that said, everything inside this circle is under protection. Everything outside is contested ground. And I was living right in the middle of a territorial dispute I barely understood, between forces I couldn't hope to match. The question was no longer whether violence would come, it was when, and whether I'd survive it when it did. That answer came sooner than I expected. It happened on a Saturday night. I remember because I'd spent the day in town, buying supplies and trying to act normal, while my mind churned over everything I'd witnessed. The cashier at the feed store asked if I was feeling all right, said I looked tired. I told her I'd been having trouble sleeping, which was true enough, if only she'd known why. I got back to the ranch around 6, fed the animals, checked the cameras. Nothing unusual in the daylight footage, just the normal rhythms of ranch life, if you ignored the circle of stones and the knowledge that something massive prowled my property every night. I made dinner, tried to watch TV, couldn't focus, ended up on the porch with Rufus, watching the sun sink behind the Black Ridge Mountains. The forest seemed darker than usual as the shadows lengthened, deeper, like it was holding its breath. Rufus felt it too. He kept whining, pressing against my leg, eyes fixed on the tree line. When I finally went inside around 10, he refused to follow. Just sat on the porch, staring into the darkness, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I should have stayed up, should have kept watch. But exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep in my chair with the rifle across my lap, boots still on. The sound that woke me wasn't anything I could identify at first. A deep, rhythmic booming, like someone slamming a sledgehammer against wood. It took my sleep-fogged brain several seconds to place it. Something was hitting the barn. Hard. I was on my feet and moving before I was fully awake, grabbing a flashlight, chambering around. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. Outside, the booming continued, punctuated now by the screaming of horses and the panicked lowing of cattle. Rufus was barking frantically from somewhere in the darkness. I hit the porch at a dead run, flashlight beam cutting through the night. The barn was maybe 60 yards away, and in the moonlight I could see it shaking with each impact, the whole structure shuddering like it was going to come apart. Then I saw them. Multiple shapes, hunched and moving with that awful, jerking gait, surrounding the barn. They were trying to get inside, to get at the horses. One of them was literally throwing itself against the barn door, over and over, the wood cracking under the assault. I don't remember making the decision to run toward them. Stupid, in retrospect. I should have stayed at the house, called for help, anything but charge into the darkness with a rifle and a flashlight. But those were my horses in there, my animals, my responsibility. I made it maybe 30 yards before my boot caught on something in the dark. A root, a rock, I don't know. I went down hard, flashlight flying from my hand, rifle nearly slipping from my grip. Hit the ground face first, got a mouthful of dirt and grass. That stumble saved my life. Something massive moved over me in the darkness. I felt the displacement of air, caught a glimpse of an enormous shape silhouetted against the stars. Then, impact. A sound like a car crash, followed by a shriek that made my blood freeze. Not human, not animal. Something else entirely. I rolled onto my back, fumbling for the flashlight, and saw them. The creature, my protector, I understood now, grappling with one of the intruders not 10 feet from where I'd fallen. They were locked together, and even in the scattered moonlight, I could see the difference between them. The creature was taller, broader, moving with controlled power. The intruder was all rage and desperation, clawing and biting. The creature threw it aside like it was made of straw. The thing hit the ground, rolled, came up, snarling. Around the barn, I could see the other shapes turning, abandoning their assault on the building, converging on this new threat, on the creature that had just saved me from being trampled, or worse. I found my rifle, found my feet. My hands were shaking, but my head was clear now, adrenaline burning through the fog of sleep and fear. 4 of them, maybe 5, circling the creature. They were going to overwhelm it through sheer numbers. I didn't think, just raised the rifle and fired into the air. Once, twice, 3 times. The shots cracked across the night, echoing off the mountains. Everything stopped. The intruders froze, heads whipping toward me. The creature stood motionless, and even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I felt its attention shift in my direction. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. We were all frozen in that moment. Me with my rifle, the creature standing between me and the barn, the intruders watching from the darkness, waiting to see what would happen next. Then one of the intruders made a decision. It broke from the group, charging directly at me in that awful, loping run. I could hear its breath, see its eyes reflecting the moonlight. 20 yards away. 15. My rifle was coming up, but I knew I wouldn't make it in time. The creature moved. I don't know how something that size could move so fast, but it was there, intercepting the charge, grabbing the intruder mid-stride. They went down together, rolling across the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. The other intruders attacked then, all of them at once, and I started shooting for real. I don't remember much of what happened next. The mind does strange things during violence. It fragments, focuses on details while losing the larger picture. I remember the rifle kicking against my shoulder, the muzzle flash lighting up the darkness in strobes. I remember shooting high, into the air mostly, trying to create noise and chaos rather than hit anything. I wasn't trying to kill, wouldn't have known what I was shooting at anyway in that darkness. But the shots had an effect. The intruders broke off their attack, scattering toward the tree line in that disturbing half-run, half-crawl. I kept firing until the magazine was empty, the clicking of the empty chamber loud in the sudden quiet. The creature stood in the middle of the yard, breathing hard. I could hear it from 30 feet away, deep, labored breaths that sounded almost human. It turned toward me, and for the first time, we were face to face with nothing between us. No fence, no distance, no camera lens. I should have been terrified. This thing was massive, easily 8 feet tall, shoulders like a linebacker, arms that had just thrown multiple attackers around like rag dolls. It could have killed me without breaking a sweat. But I wasn't afraid. Not of it, anyway. We stood there, staring at each other in the moonlight. I couldn't make out details of its face, too dark, and I'd lost my flashlight in the fall. But I could feel its eyes on me. Assessing, considering, maybe even grateful? Then it turned and walked toward the forest, moving with a pronounced limp I hadn't noticed before. It had been injured in the fight, protecting my property, protecting me. "Wait!" I called out, surprising myself. My voice sounded strange in the night air, hoarse and uncertain. The creature paused at the fence line, but didn't turn around. Just stood there for a moment, then continued into the trees, swallowed by the darkness within seconds. I was alone in my yard, surrounded by evidence of violence I could barely process. Shell casings scattered around my feet, deep gouges in the earth where the combatants had fought. And now that my ears had stopped ringing from the gunshots, I could hear the horses in the barn, still panicked but alive, still safe. I checked on them first. All 3 were unharmed, just terrified. The barn door had held, though it was badly damaged, deep cracks running through the wood where something had repeatedly slammed into it. I'd need to replace the whole thing, but that could wait until daylight. Rufus found me as I was securing the barn. He was limping slightly, but otherwise okay. Must have been thrown or knocked aside during the chaos. He pressed against my leg, trembling, and we stood there together in the darkness, neither of us ready to go back inside yet. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. I spent the remaining hours before sunrise walking the property, rifle reloaded and ready, checking on the cattle, examining the damage. The animals had calmed down, but they were wide-eyed and spooked. It would take days before they settled completely. When the sun finally rose, I saw the full extent of what had happened. The ground around the barn was torn up like a battlefield. Deep footprints everywhere, the massive ones I'd come to recognize as belonging to the creature, and others. Smaller, but still far too large to be human. I counted at least 4 distinct sets. Blood, too. Dark stains in the dirt and grass. I couldn't tell whose, the creature's, the intruder's, maybe both. The trail of it led toward the forest, then disappeared at the tree line. But what stopped me cold was what I found near the eastern edge of the stone circle. More blood, and in it, clear as day, a handprint. Not quite human. The proportions were wrong. Fingers too long, palm too wide. But undeniably, a hand. Pressed into the earth like someone had knelt there, injured, supporting themselves before moving on. The creature had been hurt worse than I'd thought, and it had crawled or walked back to the forest, bleeding, after saving my life and my animals. I spent the morning reinforcing the barn, checking the fence, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to follow that blood trail, to find the creature and, what, thank it? Help it? The idea was absurd, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I owed it something. That we'd crossed some kind of threshold last night, formed a bond neither of us had asked for but couldn't ignore. Around noon, I finally went inside and reviewed the camera footage. What I saw made my hands shake. The creature hadn't just been protecting my property. It had been protecting me specifically. When I'd fallen, when that intruder had turned toward me, the creature had abandoned its defensive position at the barn, had left the horses vulnerable to intercept the attack. It had made a choice in that split second: save the human or save the animals. It had chosen me. The footage showed the full brutality of the fight. The creature taking blows meant for me, throwing itself between me and the attackers over and over. By the time I'd started shooting, it was already injured, already bleeding. But it hadn't retreated, hadn't abandoned its position, not until I was safe. I sat back from the laptop, trying to understand what I was feeling. Gratitude, certainly. Awe at what I'd witnessed. But also guilt. This thing had been wounded defending property that wasn't even its own, protecting a human it had no reason to care about. Why? What drove it to do that? What did it want from me? The answer, when it came, would be simpler than I expected. But first, I had to figure out how to communicate with something I barely understood. How to say thank you across a gulf of species and experience that seemed impossible to bridge. I didn't know it then, but the creature was about to show me the way. The creature didn't come back that night, or the next. The cameras showed nothing but normal wildlife: deer, a fox, once a black bear ambling past the fence line without incident. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so, like everything in it was holding its breath. I spent those 2 days repairing damage and thinking. The barn door got replaced. The torn-up ground around it got smoothed over. But my mind kept circling back to that blood trail, to the image of the creature limping into the forest, injured because of me. I needed to do something. Needed to acknowledge what had happened, to show... what? Gratitude? Respect? I didn't even know if the creature would understand human gestures. But doing nothing felt wrong. On the third evening, I gathered supplies. Not food. Somehow offering food felt patronizing, like leaving scraps for a dog. Instead, I collected things that seemed more appropriate for an equal. A coil of strong rope. A container of rock salt for the animals. A pair of my old work gloves, heavy leather, barely worn. Tools and materials. Things that said, I see you as someone who works, who builds, who maintains. I carried them to the tree line at the eastern edge of the property, near where the blood trail had disappeared. Found a fallen log and arranged everything on it, neat and deliberate. Then I stepped back and waited, feeling foolish but determined. Nothing happened. The forest stayed silent. As the sun set, I finally gave up and headed back to the house, wondering if I'd misread everything. Maybe the creature was gone for good. Maybe it had decided protecting my ranch wasn't worth the cost. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept getting up, checking the windows, looking toward the tree line. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the laptop, reviewing old footage for details I might have missed. When dawn came, I walked out to check the offering. My heart was pounding for reasons I couldn't fully explain. The rope was gone. The salt was gone. But the gloves were still there. One of them, anyway. The right glove lay neatly folded on the log, positioned with obvious care. The left one had been taken. I picked up the remaining glove with shaking hands. It had been folded so precisely, the fingers aligned, the cuff smoothed flat. This wasn't random. This was deliberate communication. The creature had taken one glove and left one. Shared the offering rather than taking it all. Or returned half of it? Like a gesture of exchange? Then I saw what was underneath the glove. A rock, flat and smooth, with something laid across it. I bent closer, my breath catching. It was a piece of bark, maybe 6 inches long, with marks carved into it. Not random scratches. These were deliberate, careful. Symbols or shapes I didn't recognize, but the intentionality was unmistakable. The creature had made this, had left it here for me to find. I picked it up with trembling fingers, running my thumb over the carved surface. This was language, communication, an attempt to reach across the impossible divide between us. I stood there for a long time, holding that piece of bark, trying to understand what it meant. The shapes didn't form any pattern I recognized, not letters, not pictures, just abstract marks that might have meant everything or nothing. But the attempt itself meant something. It meant the creature wanted to communicate, wanted me to know. What? I took the bark back to the house and spent the morning studying it, photographing it from every angle, trying to find meaning in the marks. I got nowhere. Whatever message the creature had tried to send, I lacked the context to receive it. That evening, I tried again. Took more supplies to the tree line, this time a hatchet with a good blade, some wire for mending fence, and a wool blanket I'd had for years but rarely used. And I left something else, a piece of paper with a simple drawing. A stick figure human, me, standing next to a much larger stick figure. And between them, a crude sketch of my house and barn. I was trying to say, I understand. You protect this place. Thank you. The next morning, the supplies were gone. All of them, including the blanket. But in their place was something that made my throat tighten. The glove. The left glove I'd offered 2 days ago, the one the creature had taken. It was back, laid carefully on the log, and it wasn't empty. Inside it was a bundle of something. Dried plants, maybe herbs, wrapped in large leaves I didn't recognize. The bundle smelled sharp and clean, like pine and something medicinal. And tucked beside it was another piece of bark, this one with different markings. I sat down hard on the ground, overwhelmed. The creature had taken my offering, then returned with gifts of its own. Not just acknowledging the exchange, but reciprocating it. This was trade, communication, the beginning of something I didn't have words for. Whatever barrier had existed between us, between species, between worlds, we were finding a way across it. Slowly, clumsily, but genuinely. I took the glove and its contents back to the house in a daze, laid everything out on the kitchen table, and just stared at it for a while. Physical proof that I hadn't imagined any of this, that somewhere in those mountains lived something intelligent and aware, something that understood reciprocity and gratitude and the basic foundations of relationship. The cameras that night showed the creature again for the first time since the battle. It was still limping slightly, favoring its right side, but moving with more ease than I'd expected. It walked the fence line slowly, pausing at the stone markers, checking the barn and the pasture, making sure everything was secure, making sure I was safe. And I realized something then, watching that grainy footage in the pre-dawn darkness. This wasn't about territory anymore. Wasn't about some abstract protective instinct. The creature had made a choice to defend this place, these animals, and the human who lived here. And in making that choice, it had claimed something deeper than territory. It had claimed responsibility, maybe even kinship. The thought should have seemed crazy, but sitting there, with that carved bark and those strange herbs on my table, with footage of an 8-foot creature patrolling my land like a guardian, it felt like the only explanation that fit. My ranch had become part of something larger, and so had I. The exchanges continued. Every few days, I'd leave something at the tree line. Tools, mostly, things that might be useful. A whetstone for sharpening. Lengths of cord. Once, a tarp that had been sitting unused in my shed for years. And every time, the creature would take some items and leave others. Always with those carved pieces of bark I still couldn't read, but kept in a box by my bed. The animals changed too. Gradually, over the course of weeks, the fear drained out of them. The cattle started grazing near the fence line again, spreading out across the pasture like they used to. The horses stopped panicking at shadows. Even Rufus would venture off the porch after dark, though he still gave the tree line a wide berth. They could sense what I'd come to understand. The threat wasn't the creature. It had never been the creature. Those things that had attacked the barn, those were the danger. And they hadn't been back since that night. The creature's presence, its patrols, its markers, they were keeping something far worse at bay. I started thinking of my ranch differently. Not as land I owned, but as land I shared. Territory that existed under a protection I hadn't asked for, but had come to depend on. The stone circle around my house wasn't a cage. It was a promise. A boundary that said, this is safe. This is defended. And that defense had a price, though not one the creature ever demanded. The price was understanding, acceptance, the willingness to share space with something the rest of the world said didn't exist. I could live with that. One morning in late October, I found something different at the tree line. Not supplies or carved bark, but an arrangement of stones and branches forming a crude marker, pointing deeper into the forest. An invitation? A request? I stood there for a long time, staring at that marker, trying to decide. Every instinct said going into those woods was a bad idea. But something else, curiosity, trust, maybe just the need to understand, pulled me forward. I followed the markers. There were more of them, spaced every 100 yards or so, leading me along a game trail I'd never noticed before. The forest grew thicker, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the light. I kept my hand on the rifle slung over my shoulder, though I wasn't sure what good it would do if things went wrong. After maybe 20 minutes, I reached a small clearing and stopped dead. The creature was there. Sitting on a fallen log, its massive frame somehow looking almost relaxed. This was the closest I'd ever been to it in full daylight, and the details hit me all at once. The dark, reddish-brown hair covering most of its body. The human-like hands, oversized but unmistakably structured for manipulation and tool use. The face. God, the face. Not quite human, not quite ape, but something in between. Intelligent eyes that watched me with an awareness that made my chest tight. We stared at each other across the clearing. Neither of us moved. I don't know what I'd expected, aggression maybe, or fear, but what I saw in those eyes was something closer to acknowledgement, recognition. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The weeks of exchanges, the gifts, the protection. This was the creature showing itself fully, stepping out of shadow and legend into the clear light of day, trusting me to see it and not react with violence or betrayal. I slowly raised my hand, not threatening, just a wave, a greeting. The creature tilted its head slightly, then mimicked the gesture. Its massive hand raised, fingers spreading in a motion that was eerily human. We stayed like that for maybe 5 minutes, just existing in the same space, acknowledging each other. Then the creature stood, the sheer size of it making my breath catch, and turned toward deeper forest. It looked back once, those intelligent eyes meeting mine, then walked away. Within seconds, it had vanished into the trees as completely as if it had never been there. I stood in that clearing for a long time after, trying to process what had just happened. I'd met it, face to face, in the daylight, with nothing between us, and we'd both walked away. The walk back to the ranch felt different, like I was returning to a place I understood in a new way. The forest wasn't just trees and wildlife anymore. It was home to something remarkable, something that had chosen to protect my small piece of land for reasons I might never fully understand. That night, I started writing all of this down. Every detail I could remember, from the first strange behavior of the cabal to that moment in the clearing. Not for publication. I'm not ready for that kind of attention, and I don't think the creature is either. But for myself, to make sense of it, to have proof that it really happened. If you've listened this far, if you've stayed with me through this whole impossible story, I don't know what to tell you. Believe it or don't. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know if anyone else has experienced anything like this. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. I might share more in the future if I can figure out how to do it without betraying the trust that's been built. Because that's what this comes down to in the end. Trust. The creature trusted me to see it and not destroy the fragile thing we'd built. And I have to trust that sharing this story won't bring harm to something that's shown me nothing but protection. My ranch sits at the foot of the Black Ridge Mountains, under the watch of something the world says doesn't exist. The cattle graze peacefully. The horses don't spook at shadows. And every few nights, the cameras capture a massive figure patrolling the fence line, checking the boundaries, keeping watch. I leave tools and supplies at the tree line. Sometimes they're taken, sometimes not. Always, there's some small gift in return. Carved bark, bundles of plants. Once a perfect geode split in half to show the crystals inside. We've reached an understanding, the creature and I. My ranch is part of its territory now, but not as property, as something it's chosen to protect. And in return, I've chosen to acknowledge its existence, to respect the boundaries it's set, to maintain the agreement we've built without words. The forest is quiet tonight, but it's not empty. It's never empty. And somehow, that doesn't frighten me anymore. It feels like home.